everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of A Sip of Knowledge with Lou Bryson and Liz Rhodes, plus this week's special guest, Nick Nagele from Whiskey Acres Distilling Company, back to try it again with us today. I think we've got everything sorted out, so looking forward to actually getting to hear from Nick this time. So I'll let your hosts give a more formal introduction to him in just a moment. Real quick before I turn things over, I'm Will Hookinga from Zavvy.co, and as always, just want to point out a couple of ways you can interact, send in questions, things like that throughout the show today. So on your right, you'll see a chat box. Feel free to say hello. Let us know where in the world you're joining us from. It's always nice to see that. If you do have a question at any point during the show, there's a little button at the bottom of the screen that says ask a question. So just click that button, type your question in. I'll be keeping an eye out for those throughout the show. And last but not least, feel free to invite your friends to join us. There's a button at the top, a share button at the top that makes it easy to do that. But with that out of the way, Liz, Lou, I'll turn things over to you now.
Thank you, Will. Thank you. This is our show today. This is our do-over show. For the first time, we had a technical failure in the midst of a show. What was that? About 4 weeks ago, and so we quickly rescheduled, and we're gonna take another run at it. So this is A Sip of Knowledge, and I am one of your two hosts, Lou Bryson. I'm talking first because of alphabet. And age, I guess. So I am a whiskey writer. I have been writing about whiskey.
Beauty, Lou.
Yeah, well, that's what they always tell me. I've been writing about whiskey since about 1996. I was a managing editor of Whiskey Advocate magazine for 20 years, done a variety of other assignments, freelancing, and my book, Whiskey Masterclass, and there it is, Tasting Whiskey. Thank you, Liz. Those are the two books I'm currently pushing. I am trying to get another one off the ground, but we'll see how that happens. Anyway, I do write about whiskey. You can see me. I have a YouTube channel. It's just under my name, which is, of course, there on the screen, so I won't spell it. And today I am drinking Old Overholt 114. A cool little stablemate to the Old Granddad 114, and I mentioned in the show this is a rare whiskey because I actually bought this one. It was not a sample. They sent me a sample of Old Overholt 114, and I liked the stuff so much I went out and bought some. So that's what I'm drinking today. Liz?
Thanks, Lou. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Liz Rhodes, a technical distiller and spirit consultant. I have over a decade experience in alcoholic beverage, spanning across several different sites, spirit and product types, including beer, rum, vodka. But I think we all know my particular favorite expertise, of course, is in whiskey.
Whiskey!
Thank you, Lou.
Sorry.
I spent most of my career at a tiny little mom and pop shop known as Diageo, but now I'm currently founder and principal at Spirit Safe Consulting, as well as the director of whiskey ops and R&D at Whistlepig Whiskey. Thank you. Also, fun fact, so I currently reside in New York City Metro, but my home is in Illinois. And I learned pre-show that actually Nick and I grew up both in central Illinois-ish in farmtown communities about 40 minutes from each other. So super excited to have another Illinoisan and to talk about farming and how that relates to whiskey today.
Is that me now?
Well, I guess we should actually introduce you. Nick is the COO? Is that the
whatever?
Yeah, right.
I do these things.
Nick's one of the guys,
right?
At Whiskey Acres in Illinois, a farm distillery. There is a family farm of about 2,000 acres. You said. That supplies the grain. I'm not going to go into any more details of this. I'm actually going to try and set Nick off by just saying that whole context speech you gave us in the green room, I shouldn't say speech, the whole presentation, the whole explanation you gave us about the context of you and Whiskey Acres and how you got into this. If you could just run that by us again, that was really good. I think that'd be a great intro to your section. And by the way, welcome.
Thanks. And we're going to skip over the poop conversation.
The poop conversation does not have to happen again. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it might, but just
it might.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Liz, Lou, and Will, thank you for having me. I'm excited to make part 2 a little bit more functional than part 1 was.
Yeah.
Liz, hi neighbor. One thing that I often tell people is if you look at a map of where essentially you and I grew up, it's Northern Illinois. Culturally, it's not, but geographically, it is very much still Northern Illinois.
For Chicago and downstate. Let's just be honest here.
That's right. And both have beautiful things to offer. I've been blessed to live, where I grew up in Sheldon, Illinois. I went to school at Champaign. I lived in Chicago, and I'm in the burbs. So I've pretty much hit every facet that the state of Illinois has to offer. And so today I'm here as a co-founder, co-owner, and the COO of Whiskey Acres, which really doesn't mean anything because we printed our own business cards 8 or 9 years ago. So I have 2 business partners, Jim and Jamie Walter, who it's their family farm that we built Whiskey Acres on. To give you a little bit of backstory of how in the world that happened, I guess that's just because I'm here, I'll tell you kind of my story. I grew up on a family farm about 100 miles south of Chicago. My dad runs about 800 acres with about 100 head of Black Angus cow and calf operation. It's big enough that he needs help, but not big enough that he needs a partner. So I got kicked out, whisked away, I should say, and was fortunate enough to be able to go to the University of Illinois. And I got a degree in agriculture communications. It was actually a BS degree, which means I took a ton of work in the College of Communications and a ton of work in the College of Agriculture and the Ag Science program.
Agriculture communications is a separate degree, really?
Yep.
I was not aware of that. That's cool.
Agricultural communications and education with a specialization in advertising was my degree in.
Wow. Yeah.
And
oddly specific, and I love it.
And it's oddly applicable to what I do every day too. It's
I know. It's like they saw you coming, like, wait, I got something for you.
And my suburban friends at the time were always like, "Oh, so you're going to learn to talk to cows?" I'm like, really funny. Someday I'm going to grow up and be able to drink whiskey with Lou and Liz and put this degree to work here. So really, that's relevant because in my time at U of I found that I was blessed and unique in the fact that I was a farm boy, and there's just so many people who drive 80 miles an hour past the cornfield and don't have a clue what's happening out there. And, so many people who legitimately don't know the difference between a cornfield and a bean field. And I kid you not, there is a ton of people who truly believe that chocolate milk comes from brown cows. Like that, it's an awful thing to say, but it's true. And actually the Farm Bureau a couple of years ago did a study that found that a significant amount of people think that the signs you see on the side of a field that are advertising a particular seed corn brand, they think that's the sign of a company that owns the land that the farmer is farming. So
really?
There's just this, it's I don't remember the number, but it was like 30 or 40%. It was huge.
Wow.
And so my degree in communications led me to a job working in ag communications, where I was traveling essentially the Midwest, teaching the farm to table process of all the things that happened, in a farm, on a farm, and the things that happened outside of the farm to support agriculture. And I was working for a big communications firm and eventually got to work, moved away from that program. But in that program, I kind of recognized like the gap that exists from what we do to what people think we do. And really, really like got a passion for teaching about that. But I still needed to pay the bills. So I took a position with a seed company, and I was managing a sales territory from basically Chicago to about 150 miles west to Dixon, Illinois. And was growing the brand. And through that, I got to know a couple of guys, Jim and Jamie Walter, who were essentially customers of mine. Both their father and son, both University of Illinois grads as well. One has a degree in engineering and one eventually got a law degree. And so not your typical farmers, very, very successful. The farm there in DeKalb has been operated by the family for nearly 100 years. And then they go back to essentially farming in Portsmouth, Ohio in the late 1800s. So they moved to, there's better land in DeKalb than there is in that section of Ohio. Very progressive, very thoughtful, very, very entrepreneurially minded. And, we got to know each other very well over a lot of coffee and a lot of whiskey. And in that sort of entrepreneurial progress, they came up with the concept of starting a distillery on their farm, and essentially invited me to join them in putting together a business plan. And should we move forward, offered me the opportunity to buy into the organization. And so for me personally, Whiskey Acres was very much about, being part of something that had a lot of opportunity, but even more so about creating a platform for people to come visit us and learn about agriculture and do it over to drink, and to be something that was very approachable, very inviting, and very transparent. So we refer to ourselves as an estate distillery. Our tagline is from seed to spirit, because we truly control the process from the seed we put in the ground to the spirit that we put in the bottle. And when you come visit our space, you're a consumer having a tour. Our tours start at a cornfield, where we talk about what we do here and how that impacts what we do over here to ultimately become a bottle of whiskey. So the farm itself is about 2,000 acres, primarily grows corn.
Is that what we're looking at behind you? Is that the farm, or is that just a farm?
I don't think I put that there.
Okay.
So
it's just the background then.
It could be. It looks familiar.
Okay.
If I remember back to part one, I think one of you guys mentioned that you stole this from a website or Facebook.
Oh, it's from your website. We'll just post it. Yeah.
So probably. Oh, are you going to school? Excuse me for a sec. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you in a couple hours, okay? Can you say, go Whiskey Acres?
Go Whiskey Acres!
All right.
Gotta start them young.
The other day, we were talking to the kids about, I have 5-year-old twins. So my son Gunnar is probably going to blast through here in a second as well. We were talking about what mommy and daddy do. And they said, what's mommy do? And they said, she goes to work and she works on a computer. What's daddy do? He's Whiskey Acres. And like, I was really proud of it. And at the same time, like, felt very badly for my wife, who, to be honest with you, is the only one in the family who makes any money right now. So her actually going to work is very important to the viability of my family. So I need to retrain them on the messaging of how to kind of get excited about mommy's work too, because mommy's work allows Whiskey Acres to happen in my life.
I know that. I know that feeling precisely.
So in summary, we grow corn, likely a picture of the farm. In fact, it is a picture that we're looking at there. I'm sorry, one more. Yes, bud. Come here, give me a hug. It's the last day of preschool, so we're sending them off, and then I'm going to go pick them up.
This is going better than our last time together. So
Go ahead, yes.
Can you say hi?
Um,
You want me to use your fancy?
Hi, bye.
Bye-bye. Love you.
bye.
Okay.
All right. I think we should be safe.
The pleasant interlude.
So we grow corn, soybeans. Soybeans are purely a rotational crop to break up disease and replenish nutrients. And then we grow wheat, rye, and for the last 2 years, have been growing our own barley as well.
I gotta say, I've been reading about crop rotation since, a long time. I remember actually studying it in college when I was studying medieval science and technology. And I never knew the whole thing about breaking disease cycles until about 2 years ago. So, I learned that from booze. I didn't know that. It's
really kind of important and interesting. If you plant corn on year 1 and then plant corn on year 2, you have to, and it's often done and there's nothing wrong with it, but you have to almost overmanage it to make sure that the remnants from the previous year's diseases as well, so you get insects that move in and don't want to leave, right? So if they're there 1 year and you plant the same crop the next year.
Oh boy, corn again.
Woohoo! Goody, right? you've got soil-borne diseases, as well as just the nutrients that the corn draws from the ground are often replenished by soybeans. So by planting that corn there the next year, you've got to, it takes more fertility and other technologies to make that comparable from a yield standpoint. So that crop rotation is very important. And it's also interesting, like if you plant corn and then beans and then wheat and then go back to the corn, that the yield on the corn on year 3 or 4 being away from the original corn crop is wonderful. It's an easy crop to grow because you're farther away from those diseases.
Thank you.
You mentioned your.
I realize this is like stone tablet shit for you, Liz, but it was a revelation for me. I'm sorry.
That's all right. So you mentioned so your normal crop rotation, right, is corn and soy, and that's typical Illinois rotation in terms of crops. But you were talking about rye as well. Are you using that just as a cover crop or?
No. So great question. Specific to rye, and to your point, virtually all rye that's grown in Illinois and most rye that's actually grown domestically is grown as a cover crop to prevent soil erosion and for nutrient management.
Yep. And
because of that, when you go to buy rye seed, you're buying a commodity, mutt rye seed. There's really no genetic background behind it. And so there's no reason for there to be any R&D behind it, because you plant it and you till it back into the soil. It never really makes the grain stage.
What makes rye good for that?
It grows.
I mean, I hear that a lot. Is that it?
And there's a ton of plant material.
Oh, okay. Because of the long stalk.
Yep.
Gotcha. Yep. So it's more manure. Green manure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so number one, just from a seed input standpoint, rye is a little bit complicated because you're buying commoditized rye seed. Number two is if we were to have grown that commoditized rye seed and specifically grow it, in Illinois, we've got this wonderfully deep topsoil, this long growing season full of nutrients. And when rye grows here, it grows to 9 to 10 feet tall.
Oh my God.
And we get that typical late May, early June, 2-inch rain with 50-mile-an-hour wind, and it just blows it over.
Poof.
Wow. And so growing rye here is really easy because we have such good growing conditions. Growing it's the easy part. Harvesting it is the hard part. So knowing that, we actually worked with Dave Pickerel. Dave was part of our startup and kind of helping us to validate the business plan and source some equipment and really help us transform from aspirational to functional distillery. But in one of those many conversations, we identified the rye as a challenge, and he actually introduced us to Mike Swanson up at Far North, who is we call him the Rye King, and we were able to identify and source rye seed from him that originated in Canada, and specifically it's AC Hazlitt, and we picked AC Hazlitt for its agronomic characteristics. It's a much shorter plant with a much sturdier stalk. And that was our single focus of rye, of why we were going to grow this particular variety was agronomics. And we've successfully done that for the last 8 or 9 years. What we did not 8 or 9 years ago anticipate was the flavor profile that comes from this rye. It distills so much softer. It's got this beautiful vanilla nose, and it's not that typical like hard, bitey, spicy rye, which is what kind of our products have become known about is being sort of a softer, a bourbon drinker's rye. And we can attribute that directly to the variety of rye that we're growing. That was sort of a happy accident. And so we sourced the seed from Mike, years ago, and we've been continuing to grow our own seed for the last 8 or 9 years, whatever that is, and we've done it very well. And we've added wheat. Wheat was not a big change. In my time in the seed business, actually wheat was a particular offering that we had, and so I was very familiar with different wheat varieties, and found one that great agronomics, fantastic test weight, great disease resistance. We've been growing that for the last same time frame. And then 3 years ago, we decided we were going to put our foot in the water for growing barley, because we call ourselves an estate distillery, and we've always been very transparent about we grow corn, wheat, rye, but we've never grown our own barley. We've always sourced that. So 3 years ago, my dad actually grew barley as a nurse crop for his alfalfa, a spring barley, and we grew it and had it cleaned and malted and made a couple batches of what we like to call single varietal, single estate, single batch, single malt, if you really want to get deep into it.
A trio of singles.
Yeah. And what was really, really funny is it was a 2019, I think was the year. So maybe it was 2020. I don't remember. But the rye, that particular like spring, summer, it turned out it was really wet, and which is not what you want when you're trying to finish off one of those small grain crops. And so the yield was relatively low. We had to clean it pretty heavy. And my business partner, Jamie, was kind of like, I'm going to grow it, and I'm going to show you guys how to grow it. So we grew it there the second year, and with like identical results, like mid 30 bushel rye yield. The net result was good enough quality, great quality, but not the yield we were hoping for. So on year 3, he tripled the acres, and at harvest, the tripled acres actually, I think instead of 30 bushel rye, 35 bushel rye, it was like 80 or 90. So we are literally swimming in rye grain right now, and we're using, I should say barley, and we're making American single malt, using it as the malt for our barley, or for our bourbon, and may actually have enough that we're gonna give some to some local breweries to do kind of a collab with.
So are you malting? You're sending it out to have it malted?
We ain't nobody got time for that, Lou.
Who are you?
That's what I thought, but I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of points there. So you mentioned super wet, and that's actually great. You talked about yield in the field, but in terms of protein versus starch content, a wetter climate does lend itself to more starch content versus protein in terms of spirit yield. But also, before we were talking, so what varietal are you using again for barley?
I believe it's ND Genesis.
Oh, Genesis. Okay. And yeah, to Lou's point, so you're working with a maltster. Who are you working with?
So we've done some work with Sugar Creek. I think they're in Lebanon, Indiana.
Okay.
And then there's another one that's in like almost the Quad Cities area of Illinois, Iowa, who's relatively new, whose name I do not recall off the top of my head, but they did a batch for us last year, and almost like a trial for their setup as well as ours, mm-hmm. And then they're scaling up. And if I can remember, I'll certainly share it. But they're within 100 miles of us.
I love that I used to be able to count the micro maltsters on the fingers of both hands, and no way anymore.
Many now, yeah.
We have looked into doing it ourselves. Jim, my business partner, is very excited about the concept of it, but I've told him, I said, if you want to do it, like that is Jim's project. I want zero to do it, because he'd like to do the old fashioned way and floor malt, and you could do that. And that would be fun. But if you wanted to do it to scale, it would be, $1 million, and I'd rather not. I've put as much kind of startup capital into my projects as I want to for right now. But there are experts out there in the malting world, and we're going to use them till Jim gets really bored, I think.
Which, I mean, to be honest, somebody getting really bored is how a lot of this shit starts.
Yep.
Is that fair? Yeah.
Famous last words, right?
I wanted to challenge.
Yeah. And if you go back to like the why Whiskey Acres started on, the Walter farm, or why we started Whiskey Acres was not about Boredom was really just about diversification. I mentioned Jim and Jamie being very different farmers than most, and certainly comes with a different perspective. And in 2012, 11, 12, commodity prices were rocking, all time high, and you could be a bad farmer but be a very successful farmer at the same time. Just because the math behind $7 corn is very different than the math behind $3 corn. And they had the foresight to look out and go, well, this is not going to last. The farm itself is sitting 60 miles west of Chicago, so there's certainly going to be some sprawl to consider as well. So the farm may get smaller, but at the same time, like how can they build something that's going to last past this generation and be additive as opposed to deductive to the operations. And so they had looked into things like an estate version of Garrett's popcorn. And actually one of the big pieces of this was Jamie and his wife were working with another couple, a French, a man from France who had married essentially a woman from the DeKalb area. And Jamie and his wife were doing some custom wine crushing out of Napa and made some really, really high-end cabs. And there's a local shop that they were selling them through, and going back to like that 2009-ish time frame when the market crashed, the folks that they were using to essentially broker the wine coming from California to Illinois went bankrupt. And Jamie really got to put his law degree to use, getting that wine to cross state lines to get back here to be retailable and consumable. And he went, I never want to be involved in a business that is going to take the control out of me. I want to have possession. And so looked into growing grapes on the home farm there.
Really?
And
wow, I was just about to say, so grapes weren't going to work, so he did whiskey. But
he looked into it, and
okay.
There's a couple very successful vineyards in the area, but like in a slightly different space with different soil types and different, because we're only 60 miles west of Lake Michigan or of Chicago, we still get Lake Michigan climate. You go another 10 or 15 miles, like the lake effect goes away. So we're in this kind of weird microclimate, but the punchline is he quickly discovered the grapes needed to grow to make the wine that he likes, he couldn't do. And so, the light bulb went off of, well, bourbon is the fastest growing distilled spirit in the world. Bourbon needs to be made from corn. And he's looking back out at his backyard at a cornfield, 2 plus 2 equals 4. Right. And so it wasn't necessarily a no brainer, but that also coincided with the state of Illinois at the time, I think had a production limit for a craft distillery at like 5,000 gallons, which it's a hard volume to grow a successful business on. They changed that in that 2011-ish timeframe from 5,000 to 15,000 gallons, which is still not very big. But if you're a startup distillery and you can make 15,000 gallons and sell 15,000 gallons, you're doing okay. And then move that forward. I think today it's like 100,000 is our craft distillers limit. So that state of Illinois law changing at the same time of the sort of aspirational look at what can we do to diversify the farm all sort of came together. And then I showed up at their doorstep one day and said, hey, you want to buy some seed and drink some whiskey? And I'm like, oh, well, all right, here we go. It all kind of came together.
So you guys were whiskey drinkers before you started making whiskey?
Sure.
I mean, not that that's that weird, but
no, we certainly weren't experts, but we knew what we liked. I look at my whiskey as like Caesar. It's up or down, right? Thumbs up or thumbs down, and I have, a very clear, I know what I like and I come across things and I know if I don't like it. And Jamie, on the other hand, because of his kind of tenure in the wine world, he's pretty good at extracting the nuances of flavor profiles and doing a very good job of communicating those. I can remember back to that first job, or one of my first jobs out of college. I was working for a public relations firm and doing a lot of work for agribusinesses. And my boss at the time put me in charge of like First Fridays, or of I should say a First Friday, because by the time I was done with it, they didn't let us do it anymore. But I essentially created a bar crawl across everyone's office and had everyone have a theme. And one of the guys who
Wow.
was a host, John Mose was his name, and he was a whiskey guy. And he did a session on the different whiskeys of the world. So he had a Scotch, and he had an Irish whiskey, and had a rye whiskey, and had a bourbon whiskey. And I sat through there and went, holy hell, like I get this, I understand this. And at that point I didn't take a drink and go, I want to make it, but it certainly like got me appreciating, like, I don't know that I've had a Jack and Coke since then. Prior to that day, you know, I was the young guy who was like, oh, pour the sugar and pour the whiskey and let's go. And that moment is when I really had this like epiphany that there's something special, you know, with this nectar, and there's something different from one to the next, and really began to appreciate the nuances. And so because of that, that helped me sort of build my interest in the industry. And actually at one point, like my wife and I looked at moving to Tennessee. I still remember I wrote an email to Brown Foreman to tell him that I had, you know, was a communications expert and had an interest in whiskey, and no one ever responded. But, you know, but today, you know, all these little pieces from all of our lives really kind of got us to this point.
Yeah.
I will show you this. You guys saw my kids, but here, my cup, I don't know, it says Father of Wildlings. And I don't know that there's like anything more appropriate to describe those two little critters who just ran out of the back door.
So you're not the, sorry, Liz, you were.
No, I just thought it would be maybe a good point in the conversation just to talk through some of the whiskeys you have in the market and talk through your process a little bit outside of the farm.
Sure. So to speak to that, I do have to bring up the farm again. So, you know, we grow.
It all starts at the farm, right?
It all starts at the farm. I can't skip that. Because of the farm, because of the seed businesses that we're involved in, every year we're growing between 16 and 24 different varietals of yellow dent corn. And when we're planting those from the farm and the seed perspective, the seed business perspective, and looking at those results, it's almost a single-minded focus on yield, right? The way a farmer makes his living or her living is growing the most bushels per acre and doing your best to sell them at the highest market price available.
So, excuse me. So all of what you grow on the farm, is that going into the distillery, or are you selling that off as well?
We're using roughly 10% of the acres, a little less than 10% of the acres, to operate the distillery. So like we can be very selective on what we keep.
Okay.
The other 90% gets sold as a commodity. You know, there's a big ethanol facility down the road from us. A lot of it goes to the river. There's a mill that goes to cattle feed. There's a hog farm right down the road that we ship directly to. So the remnants, you know, go to the traditional corn markets, but the best of the best go to the distillery. You know, I'm going to go back to the farm again. So the technology that's on the farm is like, it's cutting edge. So we have a planter that when every seed that's planted is geolocated, it tells you exactly when it's planted, where it's planted, who is driving the tractor, the soil conditions, the temperature, all these things, the speed in which the tractor was going.
I remember you telling me this 5 years ago and blowing my freaking mind. Thank you. I'm glad we finally got to this.
And so all that information, you know, it begins to tell you a story, right? So that you can't necessarily like change the ending for that season, but it helps you learn what went right and what went wrong, so that the next season you can make decisions based off of what you learned from the previous years. But what that does, though, is we all these seeds are geolocated. There's 34,000 seeds planted per acre, right? And this in real time, it's telling you that everything is mechanically working. You know, I think the first and most important piece that this technology does is it stops you in your tracks if something isn't working correctly. You know, because a lot of times when you're driving a tractor and you got a 60-foot planter behind you, if you start to creep away from like the ideal planting population, it doesn't beep at you till you get to a certain distance away from that ideal. this piece of machinery tells you exactly which row is having something go off in real time. Then you progress from there. All that information goes to the cloud. And then I think it's once or twice a week, there's a satellite that goes over the field that takes a picture of plant health. So it's essentially showing you respiration, so that like if the plants are healthy, it's a big green spot in the field. If they've drowned out, they've got disease, they've got insect, you start to see orange or red. And so there, in some cases, you can go out and make immediate agronomic inputs to kill bugs, to treat a foliar disease. If it's drowned out, there's not a darn thing you can do about it. But what it can do is it can identify places in the field that need to be addressed with tile or something like that for the following season. Then all that information then is aggregated, and in real time, when the combine is running, it gives you specific information about test weight and moisture and yield.
Hang on a second. That's the second time. That's another term I'm not familiar with. Could we test weight?
So a bushel of corn, a standard bushel of corn, weighs 56 pounds. Okay. And different corn varieties have essentially are denser. So where you take that bushel and essentially less mass equals more weight. Does that make sense? So like one kernel of corn that takes up a given amount of space weighs more than another kernel of corn that's smaller.
Okay.
Is it?
And and I feel like for the most part, it's directly relatable to starch content as well.
It is. Yep. And so basically as a farmer, bingo. So from the farmer standpoint, you want to make sure you're planting something that's no less than 56 pounds, because when you go to sell that to the market, you get docked. Anything over 56 pounds, it's like your load of corn, in sort of theory, gets you get more bushels per load of corn if you have higher test weight. But as it relates to the distillery, the more important thing is higher test weight generally means higher yield at distillation.
In distillation. Yep.
In distillation. Yeah. So the word yield for us is twofold. We look at the farm yield, we look at the distillation yield. So, but speaking of the farming side, when we're harvesting, we can identify spots of the field, different varieties that are superior in test weight, superior in grain quality, that get identity preserved. This load is going in this semi that's going to go into the whiskey bin. And that grain then is segregated and preserved to only be used for the distillery. Whereas the less quality stuff goes to the other bins and then gets sold for feed, fuel, whatever. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with it, but the cream of the crop is what we keep for ourselves. And so we've over the years, we've actually identified 3 very specific varietals of corn that we grow year in and year out that are good yield. And so that's kind of our, of all the things I talked earlier about being transparent, I will tell you everything but those 3 corn varieties. That's, and they're that special to us. And
challenge.
What's that?
It sounds like a challenge. Maybe not for this conversation, but
you could come to the distillery, and if you used a magnifying glass, you'd figure it out. But it's just something we think, makes for a kind of a fun. I can kind of be a little kitschy with you guys and not tell you, but I think it's also like it's important for us to have a little bit of a moat. And so for those of you, this is yellow dent corn. This is what makes the world go around. This is in your car. This is in your Coke. This is in your beef. This is it. If I don't have multiple varietals of this, but there are different varieties, have different cob color, have, again, different test weight because of different starch content. And when you distill these.
Could you just stick it up close to the counter? I think a lot of people have never really seen the dent. There. Yeah, you can see it right along there.
Dent?
Yeah. That's why it's dent corn.
That's why it's dent corn. And again, this is what makes the world go round here.
Yeah.
And we've identified a handful of these that are special. But to get a little bit more special, this is blue popcorn. This is called, the trade name is Shaman Blue Popcorn. And going back, I'll quote Pickerel again. I was having a conversation with Dave, and I said, Dave, how do you make bourbon from popcorn? And he chuckled and says, I don't know. I don't believe it's ever been done before. I called a buddy of mine who raises this stuff commercially for popping and said, "Hey, Andy, can you get me some popcorn?" He kind of paused and said, "I'm not going to be your competitor. I'm going to try to make whiskey out of it." We made whiskey from it. We grew, a tenth of an acre, something like that. We harvested enough to make a batch, and it was special. And so today, we have what we call our artisan series. So as you can see, I like it. So there's not much left here. But we make bourbon. So this is at least a 4-year offering where all things the same, except instead of using yellow dent corn, we use blue popcorn. And this year, we've first year was a barrel, second year was 4 barrels, third year was 8 barrels or something like that. This year will represent nearly 20% of what we distill.
Wow!
So
wow!
And it's been well received in the industry, and it's a moat. Nobody else can do this or is doing it because we invest the time on the farm. If you go to buy popcorn seed to distill, it's a $200 bottle if you pass those costs along, right? But if you invest in the acre and harvest it yourself, it's a very different value proposition.
And so popcorn in that specific varietal, that's a type of flint corn, right?
Correct.
Yep.
Correct. And when it distills, it's like this very clean distillate profile. It's like light and balanced. And what's really fun is like when we're actively cooking this and are doing tours, when you cook it, it's got like that purple bluish color, but when it's done, it's pink. It looks
pink.
like Pepto-Bismol. Yeah.
Yeah.
When it acidifies.
The anthocyanins aren't very stable. pH instability. Yeah. It's super cool to talk about. Yeah, absolutely.
So another one, this is also a popcorn. This is called glass gem popcorn.
Mm-hmm.
This is actually a prolific variety, which means that you plant one seed and it has like 6, 8, 10 different little offshoots of it, like little stumps basically, that makes these teeny tiny. I mean, to give you a perspective here, here's what we make our living off of. Okay. And you've got this. So this is like a level 10 pain in the ass. We're talking 200 bushels to the acre. We're talking 20 bushels to the acre.
What is the situation like on the field in terms of care and maintenance, though? I'm not sure in terms of hydration level or nitrogen content or how that differs between the two.
So hydrate, like nothing is irrigated here. If anything, we have bigger issues with too much moisture as opposed to not enough moisture. That's the blessing and the curse of kind of farming in Northern Illinois. In terms of nitrogen, it is managed virtually identically to the field crop or the yellow dent corn.
Mm-hmm.
If anything, it's the one piece that it gets over managed on is on foliar diseases, because it's so wet and because we have this kind of humid climate here. And these are, I would call these non-science corn, right? They're bred for the beauty, not for their agronomic characteristics. And so these leaf diseases get on them and decimate them. They make it almost impossible to finish the crop. So we found that a foliar fungicide application is 100% necessary to make any of these heirloom or sort of obscure ornamental things be agronomically successul.
Now, just to clarify, those 3 little ears you held up, those were all the same variety.
Every ear on every plant is different.
Different.
It's beautiful. And I don't know the why behind it. But I do know that when we plant these, to maybe give you a little bit more information, Liz, is we actually plant them in a segregated plot because pollen drifts, and this makes sure that this is self-pollinating and making sure that we're not sending a popcorn yellow dent hybrid to the market, because other consumers would not be happy, or processors wouldn't be happy.
How do you, when you say a segregated plot, how do you keep the pollen from spreading?
So pollen generally drifts no more than 60 feet.
Oh,
And,
okay.
yeah.
Right.
And so
No designations, right?
you essentially you plant a cornfield in the middle of a bean field.
Okay.
Is maybe like the simplest way to like visualize it, or plant this kind of stuff at the edge of a field where, like, the neighbor is going to plant soybeans, things like that, where you got to kind of look above and go, what's going to go here and what's far enough away. And then we also have at the edge of the distillery, we have our show plots where we've got a 5-acre like piece of ground that we planted to grass that we use for overflow parking and concerts and things. But we have 2 60-foot show plots there where we grow these different kind of things, to go back to what I said at the beginning about ag, to showcase ag education, to show that sweet corn and yellow dent and popcorn are all these beautiful and necessary things, but they're all different. And they all have a different reason for us to use in our lives. And you would 9 out of 10 people don't realize that sweet corn and yellow dent corn are different things. And we've actually made bourbon from sweet corn.
Oh, really?
And it's a pain in the ass.
It's got to be a mess.
It's dried sweet corn, so we let it dry down. And if this ear weighs 1.5 pounds, an ear of sweet corn weighs 1/4 pound. It is virtually impossible to get all the grain off, all the seeds off of the cob, and it's a very soft cob. But we did it because few folks have done it. We've done a couple batches and don't intend to do anymore.
I actually just cooked with dried sweet corn over the weekend. It's a Pennsylvania Dutch thing. We
really?
use dried sweet corn in a lot of things.
It's ugly. I call Grandpa's toenails. Like it is.
Oh, it is ugly. Somebody, I put a picture
Yeah.
up on Facebook, and they're like, "What's that brown shit? What is that?"
Yeah. This is probably the coolest thing we're doing right now. So this is an open pollinated yellow dent variety that we actually sourced. It was developed in Minnesota and known to make a lot of moonshine back in the day, and great agronomic characteristics. This one here is obviously a red corn variety from Italy, known for polenta, so for its flavor. So we use this as a female, so which means we detasseled it. We cut the male portion off of it and cross-pollinate it with this. So the male fertilized the female to give us junior here. So what's really like, I don't know that you could find a better visualization of like what crossbreeding can do for you.
Yeah.
And so we planted these, we detasseled this, we hand harvested this, and then hand shelled it on a 100-year-old corn sheller. And then last week or the week before, planted nearly 15 acres of this F1 output, and we'll harvest it this fall, assuming things work out as planned, and begin to make whiskey from our own in-house developed seed corn.
Do you have a name for it?
First, we got to make sure the stuff works.
Oh, well, yeah, why bother?
We'll come up with something good, and this will get patented. Assuming it works, it will get patented, and it will be proprietary to what we're doing. So, another one, I don't have a sample of it, but as I speak, our master distiller Rob is making Oaxacan green bourbon.
Oh,
yeah. And that's one that a couple of years that was actually our first experimental, and going back, like, we planted it. It was the fastest out of the ground. It was beautiful. It was tall. And then August 1st hit, and those foliar diseases hit, and it barely finished. So we've been growing it for a couple of years now, and I just learned that we just have to manage it a little bit heavier from a disease standpoint.
I went down to I don't know if you come across Robert McDonald at Dancing Star here in Pennsylvania. It's a seed farm. I went down there. Wow, when was that? 2 years ago in November. He was drying. It had been actually it might have been 19 because it was really wet, and he was talking about how much more he was spending on propane just to dry. But he had got all these bins of different colored corn. It was amazing. It was beautiful. And the Oaxacan was there. That's what made me.
When we're looking at these, one of the things that's important is the relative maturity. So you've got different corn varieties that have different growing seasons based off of where they're developed. And like the typical sort of growing season for us, like the number is between 103 and 112 day. And which basically means that the lower the number, the faster it goes to maturity, and the drier it will be at harvest. The higher numbers are often higher yielding, but don't reach maturity. Sometimes don't reach maturity in time, and so you're in the worst case scenario having to harvest immature corn, which is basically like corn mush, and it's a very unhappy farmers. And in the less severe scenario, you're harvesting mature but very wet corn, so like 28%. And to your point, Lou, it spends a ton of time in the dryer, so it's expensive. But also harvesting that wet corn and drying it down to below 15% really, really impacts the quality of the grain. So by being able to harvest something, at or below 20%, or even darn close to that 15% point there, gives you just like a much more, just high quality grain. You're not putting that heat pressure on it, and it's better. It's much better. And back in the day, I can remember that my dad used to put ear corn in the corn crib where it would naturally air dry, and the grain elevator would pay him a premium for the air dried corn versus came out of the corn crib, as opposed to what was traditionally delivered and dried. And so just very anecdotal evidence that it matters.
Yeah. And I I hate to do this, but we're gonna have to wrap up fairly soon. And I just realized we never really did, except for that blue popcorn bottle.
Here. So our primary, so this is our bottled and bond bourbon. This is a 5-year offering. It's obviously it's 100 proof. One of the things that we do that's unique is that we identify the harvest year every year that we do it. And so I think we're still doing 2016 right now. So
geez, Nick, it looks like it's got some wicked good color to it too.
Well, it's one of our barrel warehouses are old grain bins that we've converted. So they're made of corrugated steel. 2 of them are Quonset buildings, essentially like post-World War II surplus. And so they get really hot and they get really cold, and we get tons of extraction. We get really deep in those staves. The whiskey in those bins has been as hot as 115 degrees and as cold as negative 35. So, find a place on the planet. Here's this. We have a bonded rye, 4 years. Also,
traditional green label. Thank you.
Traditional green label. And then we also have a straight rye offering and a straight bourbon offering. We do these. We look at these for more of the on-premise play. I should say the off-premise play, and our straight offerings are more in the off-premise play. You guys are in the whiskey world, so you can consider this a big deal or not, but both of these won double gold at San Francisco. We're darn proud of that. When Binny's reviewed them, they used a statement setting a new standard for craft whiskey. So, they don't say that very often. So
no, that's a nice pat in the back there.
We're really proud of that. In June 17th or something like that, Father's Day weekend, we're releasing a 4-year-old expression of that glass gem. So it's 101.6 proof. So I think I showed you this, but this is what we call our artisan series. These are 375 bottles. We use these to do our introductory releases for these heirloom things because they are expensive to make and they're very limited. So this gives us the ability to sell something at a $40 to $50 price point to make it easier for folks to get a hold of and just to make more of it. And then if these are successful, do people like it is the most important thing. Is it repeatable and is it profitable? Then we invest in scaling it. And I'll show you this again. And so Blue popcorn is scaled. This fall we'll have a similar bottle. It'll be red of our Bloody Butcher offering. And then in a couple of years, we'll have a fairly large scale offering of the Oaxacan green.
Cool.
And then we've got a few other, we're 5 years away from having an offering of that unnamed corn variety that we've developed on site. We've got some 4-grain stuff. We've got some experimental stuff. We've got, Liz, you're familiar with the Morton Arboretum. We've got barrels made from oak that we got from the Morton Arboretum.
Cool.
We found a local guy who recently retired police officer who's a woodworking hobbyist and starting a cooperage.
Wow.
And so
I used to live like 5 minutes away from the
awesome. So we got 6 or 8 53-gallon barrels from them, 2-year-old seasoned oak that's cooking away right now. We've got Cox Prolific. It's an heirloom varietal that was developed by General Cox. We reached out to Monticello. They sent us a whole bunch of seed. We grew it a couple of years ago, harvested it, made whiskey out of it. It won't ever grow it again. Full season stuff developed in the 1800s on the East Coast does not jive into DeKalb, but just from the farming side, but from the whiskey side, it made very interesting stuff, and we're excited.
That's a great name too.
Yeah, that's right.
A quick question, just in terms of your different whiskeys with the different varietals that you're using, what are some of the big flavor differentiations between your different?
So when, this is cliche, but when we distill like the Oaxacan, it almost distills like a rye whiskey. Like it's got this like very, very almost spicy, and at the same time this like cornflake forward nose that it distills very differently than the yellow dent. The blue popcorn, very soft, very subtle, very buttery. Again, it's cliche, right? And then the thing that we're sort of pushing hard is identifying the why behind the yellow dents. So we know that there's an is, right? But we don't know the why. And so much so that our master distiller Rob wrote his master's thesis from Heriot-Watt University on how varietals of corn affect the flavor of whiskey. And so I was talking to him ahead of this conversation, and he said, in my work, I found that there's only 2 that in the several that I used that had, a consumer identifiable difference. And my challenge to him was, well, I wouldn't look at it that there was only 2. I would look at it that we found 2. Right. that it gives us something to work off of. So we can work backwards to look at the genetics of those, to look at where it was grown and when it was grown, to see if there's terroir drivers behind this, if it's genetic drivers behind this, if it's both.
Lipid content.
Right. So I can't come to you and tell you that we have the answers. I can tell you that we have identified the question. We know that there is an answer but just haven't found the why. But we're working very hard to find the why so that we can make it repeatable to really drive the way that we make our stuff and plant very specific things to give us a known output. We often make the analogy of like growing a single varietal on a single estate from a wine standpoint to know that you're going to get something special, as opposed to table grapes to make table wine, right? And they make something that's adequate, but we think that commoditized, homogenized corn takes away from the nuances and the specialty that give you the flavor of home. And
I know Pickerel was on that whole homogenous thing.
Yeah, I mean,
he always said, you put a whole bunch of big fields together, it's no wonder nothing tastes different. Of course, it's all going to taste the same. Yeah,
and that's we still have big fields, but we also have the ability to preserve specific things from each of those fields and make special stuff from them. So,
no, I'd be off on a whole other tangent.
Yeah.
We really have to. We got to wrap up, unfortunately.
I did just for comedic relief. I recall growing up, obviously in Central Illinois, there was a town nearby, and their mascot was the corn jerkers. And obviously, as a teenager, I didn't appreciate what that meant, but now being in the whiskey biz, I do. So I really appreciate your time today, Nick, and walking through kind of what you guys are doing.
I need to know, Liz and Lou, would you like me to get you the t-shirt? I have one.
Yes.
Ooh.
I
Ooh.
absolutely, I was going to say that. I'm obsessed
Yeah.
about the tea. Love one.
There's a fun story. We don't have time for it, but there's a fun story about why you jerk the corn off the stalk is why. And there was a newspaper that referred to these guys as the corn jerkers because they had nothing to do but jerk corn, and it stuck. And back then it was the word jerk was, I think, very differently applied. Than
Oh,
it
right,
is
sure.
today,
Soda
you know?
jerk. Yeah.
15-year-old, the
Yeah.
context. I mean, like,
Used to be the sweet corn capital of the world, Hoopeston, Illinois. Home of the
Woo.
corn jerkers.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah, the corn jerkers. Anyway, Nick, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you. I'm glad we could recreate and actually have audio and visual and all.
Yeah.
The
Made a big difference. You
Yeah.
sounded a lot smarter this time.
I did
Speaking of
wanna-
which, thank both of you.
Yeah, you know.
I want to thank both of you for putting up with my stupid questions. I know I asked a lot of them today, but I learned a lot. It was great.
No, and I would like to point out my T-shirt here. You know, we're on a mission to make sure folks know that you can legally and successfully make bourbon whiskey in the state of Illinois.
And do you think they actually know that that's Illinois? Do you really?
Well, you know,
you're an optimistic man.
That's fair.
I did want to point out, so once again, the green rectangle at the bottom of the screen, there's actually a little link to learn more about Whiskey Acres. So I would encourage everyone to go check that out.
Do that.
So yeah, here we go. So I'm going to tee up the next show.
Another do-over.
In 2 weeks' time, so June 7th, we have Adirondack Cooperage back on with Joe Blazowski. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. Yeah, so please come back, check us out in 2 weeks. We're super excited about that show. In the meantime, go check out and Whiskey Acres and support Illinois bourbon because it's a thing.
And look at farm fields when you drive by them.
Yes.
Yeah. And chocolate milk does not come from brown cows.
And on that, thanks, Nick. Appreciate it.
Thanks to you all very much.
Nick,
Liz, great to see you.
Yeah, good to see you guys. Thank you.
Bye-bye.